We know how the Worldsoul Saga will end. And yeah, okay, that's quite the statement. What's more, when you see how I intend to back it up, you might get angry with me, but please just hear me out. So this all begins with West Studio releasing early concept art that they did for The War Within. Extremely early. This concept art was done in 2021. War Within was only announced in 2023. One of the artists, Jeremy Paylerton, also posted many of these and other images on his ArtStation. I'll link to both below. As West Studio themselves made clear, a lot of this concept art was never directly used in-game, but instead provided pre-production inspiration that influenced the vision of several key locations that are in the final release. And we can see this ourselves, with images that clearly show early versions of places in Hallowfall, Azkahet, and the Ringing Deeps. Now, there are a lot of pictures, and I want to go through most of them, but before we look at any of the others, I have to highlight these 5, because they are the ones that clearly show Azeroth herself. I mean, giant Worldsoul Azeroth, and not shaped like the big glowing soul we usually see in visions, but Azeroth in her true form, the physical, titan-like body we'd imagine she'd have once she's awakened. Not all of her, but her hands and a close-up of her eye. And in fact, we can see a progression with these images. The eye is closed, a hand floats in the water, as if she's asleep in the womb, which she is. Whether she's a titan or not, we know that world souls are nascent beings that have yet to be awoken. But in some of these images, it looks a bit like she might be stirring. This one in particular, her hand is clutching onto the rock, as if she's pressing down to move it aside, or even move herself. I am fairly confident that the Worldsoul Saga is going to end with Azeroth's birth. And okay, it's early concept art of something we definitely haven't seen in the War Within. For all we know, this idea has been scrapped completely. There is no reason to believe it will ever happen. The post says a lot of these images weren't directly used in-game after all. They also mostly show Azeroth asleep, not Azeroth being born. So why am I so confident they hinted how the Worldsoul Saga ends? Honestly, because Chris Metzen himself told us as much. Well, sort of. In a wowcast that was released earlier this year, when asked about the War Within, Metzen had this to say.
When I came back, I'm like, all right, let's go, World of Warcraft. Like, what do we got? What are we making? And they were in, they had already been doing War Within, or what would become, War Within, for about 10 months.
Metzen returned to Blizzard in 2022. This concept art was done in 2021. So when he asked, what are we making? These images are probably pretty close to what he was shown.
And in a very real way, how the War Within was shaping up, they're like, yeah, dude, like there's no way on Earth, right? That that's going to divert the course of mighty rivers. There's no way to get that done on top of what we're already in production on. So that begat this idea of a larger saga. I'm like, okay, well, what if we can get there in X number of steps? What if we can build to something just ridiculous, but it might take a couple expansions to do.
So they already had an idea, something big enough to divert the course of mighty rivers while planning out the War Within. Realized that they would not be able to get to this giant thing within one expansion, and Chris's solution was to have a saga instead, which they then called the Worldsoul Saga. Gee, I wonder what that big idea was. I mean, who are we kidding? It was obviously this. The name was already a dead giveaway, right? I know my bets have been on the Worldsoul Saga wrapping up with Azeroth's birth, probably showcased in one of those incredible Blizzard cinematics, pretty much since the expansion trilogy was announced. For a start, you don't introduce the concept of our planet containing a giant lady waiting to be born and not have her be born. From the moment it was confirmed Azeroth contained a giant nascent world soul, this future, or a version of it, was already written in stone. Azeroth is going to be born. That has always been a story beat we can be sure would happen. The only question has been when. It was always going to be huge, so you expected it to happen at some really, really important time. Like, say, at the end of a saga. And if you're the sort of person to bet on a World of Warcraft 2, I'm not, but if you are, Azeroth's birth would pretty much be the best possible excuse to transition to that. I have to say, I do still think, if we're very lucky, we could get this exact scene at the end of the War Within. This moment where we get to see Azeroth's world soul, but still asleep. After all, the Coreway is meant to be able to lead us directly there. And in case you need a refresher, the Coreway is a construct that is supposed to lead directly to the center of Azeroth. The Earthen built and maintain it, but their edicts also forbid them from going all the way down to the end of it. It's a bit strange. Eldegon even wonders about it in her journal. My edict was to build and maintain the structures and facilities of Dornogal and the Coreway. But why? Why is the Coreway so important? The Coreway descends to the middle of Azeroth, but why did the Titans need access to the world's center? Is there another installation there? More earthen, toiling in the dark? Of course, we know what's at the world center, the World Soul. We also know why the Titans don't want the earthen going down there. During the Archives MetaQuest, we found out that the Titans had identified that Azeroth contained not just any World Soul, but the most powerful World Soul in existence.
To create order from the chaos of the cosmos, the Titans search the great dark beyond for the prime World Soul. This World Soul, the most powerful in existence, they would guide to become the greatest Titan of all.
And as part of making sure this World Soul would be born a Titan, the Titans had their keepers wrap the planet in the Manifold, a complex world-spanning system of Titan-forged installations and machinery. They also started building the Coreway.
At the Titan's command, we Keepers began the acclamation. Each installation, all linked to the Manifold, produced vast numbers of Titan-forged workers. We fired the great forges to fuel the acclamation and empower the Manifold to heal the ravaged world. Then began construction of the Coreway, a direct channel to the heart of Azeroth that would allow the Titans to study the World Soul without harming it.
And then, to protect the World Soul from the corrupting influence of the Old Gods, the Titan Forged placed a construct around the World Soul known as the World Core. But the Earthen who built the World Core began to change. Exposure to the World Soul not only caused them to crystallize, they began to rebel against the Titans, trying to break the World Core and the Manifold.
The great Khaz'goroth revealed to me that the corrupting influence of the imprisoned Old Gods was affecting the World Soul. To protect it, we had the Earthen construct the World Core, a vast chamber at the heart of the world. There, the World Soul will slumber, with only the Titans to influence it. I must note a disturbing development. As they worked to greater depths, some Earthen began to behave erratically. This could not be countenanced. Most units were repaired and continued their work, but some began to physically change and crystallize. They named themselves Thragar. These faulty units were so greatly affected that they rebelled against us, attacking and damaging the World Core. In the course of studying them, it was determined that long exposure to the World Soul's energies led to the changes exhibited in their core directives. If we cannot prevent this from happening, it will prove catastrophic to not only the World Core, but to the Manifold itself. Measures must be taken.
So Azeroth didn't want to be bound in the Titan's influence this way. She created and called on the Thragar to break her free. The Titans dealt with the Earthen Rebellion by setting up the system that purges them of the Worldsoul's influence and any related memories. That's also why they're not allowed to actually travel all the way to the end of the Coreway. The Earthen came to believe the Thragar were just legendary champions who had disappeared long ago. When Magni Bronzebeard first arrived in Khazalgar, the Earthen there called him Thragar, believing him to be one of these special crystallized Earthen. As it turns out, they were kinda right. Magni was transformed into Diamond by Azeroth herself, and when she spoke to him, it was to ask for his help, just like with the Thragar. But shortly after we arrived in Khazalgar, the Coreway was destroyed by the Nerubians. The Earthen have managed to open part of the way again, but only as far as the Ringing Deeps. Work on the Coreway is still progressing. We are supposed to end up with a passageway to the Worldsoul sooner or later. When that opens up, I do think we have a solid chance of finding this version of Azeroth at the end of it, along with, well, now it's time to look at all the other images. As I said before, there's a lot, so I tried to organize them into groups. Azeroth, of course. Images that are recognizably as Kahet, Hallowfall, or the Ringing Deeps. General underground caverns and passageways, potentially early work on the Coreway, some very interesting deep down zones that we'll talk about in a minute, and of course, the group that I will simply refer to as holes. As I said, some of the concept art has made it into the game in various ways. Some has not and probably never will. Some might have. There's some art of underground dragons that I can't help but suspect might have inspired Zaralek Caverns, a zone that I'm convinced was meant to be a bit of a War Within preview. It's worth highlighting, the early concept art for Hallowfall shows a much larger city. An early version of World of Warcraft's website for the War Within also claimed the Arathi had battled against the Nerubians for centuries. This was later changed to just say they're engaged in a continuing battle. But it is possible that the Arathi settlement in Hallowfall was originally planned to be much, much older. Maybe it was even meant to be the entire Arathi Empire before they decided that's a place that deserves its own expansion. Generally though, the fact that the concept art is both recognizable and extremely different to the final product is worth keeping in mind as we look at some of these other pictures. What you see is never going to be quite what you get. There is a suggestion that Hallowfall may have originally been planned to have several light crystals that their towns would be built around, rather than just the one in the sky. We see other crystals like this in a few images that mostly seem to exist to show off underground environments, but there's also images that suggest the early concepts that became Beledar. For a start, this pattern is reminiscent of the pattern we can see around Beledar, which is itself reminiscent of the pattern we see around the Naru ship that's crashed into Draenor or Outland. There's also this crystal that looks very much like it may contain the lava form of some creature. It reminds me of a parasite, which also immediately makes me think of Beledar and the fact that it transforms into the void every now and then. Could a parasite like this one be what's happening to that crystal? I mentioned Jeremy Peloton's ArtStation page earlier, and that includes this image, which is similar to the light crystals that seem to be originally planned for Hallowfall. Interestingly, this one seems to be pretty purposefully shaped to look like an egg. Finally, there is this crystal that is shaped similarly to Beledar, but contains this creature. Now, my first thought when looking at this was Old God, and I don't think I'm the only one. The creature bears a certain resemblance to all the Old Gods, but especially N'Zoth. It also reminds me of the giant octopus-like creature that we see on the palace wall in Azkahet. I think most significantly though, this creature reminds me of the Guardian, the giant kraken who floats around Hallowfall's sky. Specifically, it seems to circle Beledar. We don't know anything about it really, why it's there, what it's doing, but I do think this might be the early concept art of that exact creature. Now, with that in mind, take a look at these images. Doesn't this one in particular remind you of the Azkahet mural? So what is up with all the sea monster imagery that we're seeing, not only in the concept art, but in the War Within itself? Because even without this concept art, it's been established that there is something going on with all this tentacle representation in the wall within. The theme of a giant octopus or squid that's deeply interested in a giant crystal of light has been repeated enough to make that clear. When it comes to old gods and squid or octopus-like tentacles, everyone's first thought is N'Zoth. And just in case we've forgotten about N'Zoth, we're going to be reminded about his visions during the upcoming Horrific Visions event. Blizzard themselves seem to want us to have N'Zoth in our minds. But there is another creature that's really important to remember whenever dealing with Kraken. Ozumat, the patriarch of all Kraken. Ozumat isn't an old god, he's one of their forces, but he is pretty impressive. We haven't seen him in some time, but we do know he's alive. He can be spotted behind the waters in Najata. In general, Kraken are mysterious and terrifying. I mean, look at this one, it's flying. Baby Kraken are those little mind squids that sometimes control people by sticking on their heads. Oh, and in a Hallowfall side quest, we recently helped out a dark little fish who turned out to be one of these mind squids, who left with the Kraken for the sea beneath the sea, after warning us never to bring the light there because, if we do, they'll have to kill us. Oh, and by the way, some of this early concept art shows an area that seems to be under the sea, where you can look up at the sea creatures swimming about. I just think that's interesting, is all. Now, notice how some of the concept art suggests tentacles in the environment itself, almost as if we're dealing with creatures who have fossilized. This brings me to some of the most fascinating images in this artwork, the group I think of as the Black Empire's graveyard. If this is a zone in the wall within, we haven't reached it yet. Presumably, it's very deep down. I'd imagine extremely close to the Worldsoul itself. Bones and the fossilized remains of old gods and other voided creatures seem to litter this area, which also appears to be inhabited. Like, here's a city that seems to have been built on top of the remains of Cthulhu. Now, because this is concept art, I suspect the reason why some of these remains look so much like recognizable old gods is because the artists were using pictures of the old gods for inspiration. This doesn't necessarily mean Cthulhu had a twin who's been dead for thousands of years, or anything like that. On the other hand, if these are the remains of other old gods, that could explain just why there's so much old god blood in Khazalgar. Either way, I think these images are meant to show the remains of the Black Empire. The Black Empire was defeated by the Titans, and at least one image shows the remains of a fallen giant, at least their sword and helm, which suggests Titanforge to me. I do also want to speculate, once again, about the fifth old god. The Old Gods and the Ordering of Azeroth is an in-game book that dates back to before World of Warcraft itself. That is to say, the text from this book was copied from the Ordering of Azeroth section from the Warcraft 3 manual, and this book mentions 4 to 5 old gods. The exact number is something that's never been entirely clear. According to the Warcraft wiki, at some point in 2006, the number of old gods mentioned in both the website version and the in-game book was altered from 4 to 5. Sometime later, the number of old gods was removed entirely from the website version, but the in-game book still mentions 5. When Volume 1 of the World of Warcraft Chronicles came out in 2016, that book only mentioned 4 old gods, which seemed to settle the matter. Of course, now we know that the Chronicles are just like any other history book, written from the knowledge and bias of its authors. The Chronicles are written from the Titans' perspective, and as the Earthens so recently discovered themselves, the Titans can't always be trusted. When a copy of the Old Gods and the Ordering of Azeroth was added to Dalaran in Legion, it still claimed there were 5 Old Gods. It hadn't been rewritten to say 4. This could have simply been an oversight, but when an annotated version of this book was added in Dragonflight, that one also still referred to 5 old gods rather than 4. The annotated version is supposed to be Deathwing's own copy, and it's filled with his notes criticizing the Titans. He never confirms or denies the number of old gods, but he does make it clear that he, at least, didn't think the Titans' claims about that time should be taken at face value. Of course, it is Deathwing, so anything he says shouldn't be taken at face value either. I have often speculated that Xal'atath is the 5th old god, because she refers to the old gods as her brothers and talks about wanting revenge on them for something they did to her long ago, presumably Trapper and the blade we found her in. When we saw this mural in Azkahet, I was convinced this was Xal'atath's true form. For the record, I am categorically wrong, at least according to Ilaria, who seems to have been given this line specifically to correct people like me.
The Harbinger is from the Black Empire? Flames. One of the old gods?
No, something else. A survivor from the depths of time.
Ilaria also says things like,
I do not miss.
when she misses all the time, but I'll be generous and assume she's right about Xal'atath. Even so, I still think there was a fifth old god, and I think this is a picture of them. I also still think it's very possible that old god was somehow defeated or betrayed by the others, or else defeated by someone who wasn't the Titans, because it's not mentioned in the Chronicles. The Titans simply might have not told the story about that specific old god because they weren't the ones to defeat them. But wouldn't it be interesting if this old god was imprisoned, and it was that gave the Titans the idea to imprison the others? But aside from the old god graveyard, is there anything in this concept art that might hint at where we're going next? Yes and no. One expectation is that we will eventually head to a zone known as the Rootlands, the homeland of the Haranir. We still don't know a whole lot about these creatures other than they're the guardians of these roots, the roots of Eluna here, the first world tree. Presumably, their homeland would be deep within these roots and resemble something like the Emerald Dream. Part of our expectation that we might visit the Rootlands is based on an image that is apparently from early data mining. I don't know who data mined it, it wasn't Wowhead, but Doran's Veins did a video about it last year. It is possible that they ended up deciding to scale back the entire plan for the Rootlands, along with the Haranir story. This area in Azkahet could actually be the Rootlands scaled down. But the most compelling evidence for a whole dedicated zone is an area nearby. If you keep flying up here, you get sleepy and are ported away, just like with the Emerald Dream in Dragonflight before access to that zone was opened. And this concept art does have at least one tree portal that looks very much like a portal to the Emerald Dream. So if there's any hint in the concept art that a visit to the Rootlands was planned, this is it. Otherwise, War Within patches don't really seem to feature in this art. There's nothing to indicate Undermine at all. I guess you could argue that the Hallowfall Arathi areas hint at the fact that our next patch is called Legacy of Arathor. I wouldn't, but you could. There's this image, and I've seen at least some speculation that it could be hinting at visiting Koresh. Those do kind of look like broken planets, the same way Koresh does, but it's also part of a group of images that I think of as the no gravity zone. There are a few. Some, like this one, look like they could actually just be early versions of Hallowfall. Some suggest ancient ruins that have long since been abandoned. Again, maybe we're looking at the remains of the Black Empire. At least one no-gravity zone is definitely also a dead ancient giant creature zone, and notice how they both seem to involve traveling around in these Hallowfall crystal balloons. The art for at least one entrance area also seems to suggest gravity which can be switched on and off. And again, this is all just concept art. We haven't seen anything like this no-gravity zone in-game, and we may never see it at all. It'd be a pity though, because I do think it's cool. If we do end up in this area, I imagine it'd be very close to Azeroth's Worldsoul, and that we would get there with Hallowfall's help. So maybe there's a reason to make friends with those Flames Radiance people after all. One last image I would like to highlight is this one, where it looks like a hand breaking out of the earth. My first thought was Azeroth being born, but it's actually too small a hand. Thematically, it reminds me of this one, the concept of a massive creature bursting out of something that we will no doubt have to deal with. It's very cool and evocative, the sort of concept you hope to see realized in-game. But I also kinda suspect we might have already seen this one. When the Earthen disobeyed their edicts, we discovered the Titans had installed a failsafe, a giant construct that came out of the sea and attacked. This image could easily have been the original concept that became a construct coming out of the ocean. A much cooler and more impressive original concept, but you know, sometimes that's just how these things go. Basically what I'm saying is, this is the thing about concept art. Sometimes it can look so different from the final product, you might not even recognize it as the same concept at first. So while I really enjoyed going through these images and speculating for the sake of this video, I am going to remind you to take absolutely everything I've said with several bags of salt. That disclaimer out of the way, if you enjoyed this video, remember you can like, subscribe, comment, share, all that good YouTube stuff. You can also find me on Patreon, where you can join these wonderful people who help to support the channel directly. Finally, you can find me on Twitch, where I'm always happy to talk about all things lore. So while that's all for now, hopefully I'll see you again soon.